Well, all right. I'm excited that we got the podcast back up and running here today on February the 7th. Pleasure to introduce our first guest of 2025, Mr. Brant Evans. I do a lot of conferences. I've done conferences for the last 15, 18 years for New Hope, and then previously with my former employer, which was a wilderness therapeutic program, which I'm sure we'll get into some of that. But I say this wholeheartedly. There's people that come up to my table and they stick out and they separate themselves from the other hundreds of people at the conference. And you were one of those individuals. And once we talked for a few minutes, I'm like, I got to get this guy on for him to share what he's doing, what he's done, and just kind of tell his story. So, Brant, thanks for being here with us today. And I'm just gonna start off with, can you tell our listeners and those who watch this kind of a little bit about yourself, some of your history, and go from there if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good to be on. I know we were trying to schedule this much earlier, and I've had to work around the historic storm in Nashville, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, it's great to connect with you guys. Um, I usually start my story when I started as a staff in wilderness therapy, which was at an interesting time in 2011. It was kind of right before the family work was really being integrated into programs. But we were at least starting to see some of the best practices being shared. I think that there were more of an emphasis on risk management. Not that that was completely lacking before, but when we hear a lot of what I would call the horror stories, those are from like back in the day, earlier on in the industry. And so I just stumbled into the industry at that time because I had an interest in primitive skills and psychology. Didn't know what I was getting into, and then ended up doing that 8 day on, 6 day off schedule for 4 years. I think I spent like 800 nights in the woods, um, which my wife and I were laughing about because I'm now, a soft consultant, and we were watching the show Alone last night. If you guys watch,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
so I'm like, man, I used to have some skills, but yeah, I thought I was going to become a therapist, and I know Matt, you mentioned that that's your background, right?
Yep.
Um, for a while, I was so inspired by that work. It was mind blowing to me watching this process happen with the clients in wilderness therapy and the transformations possible. I mean, I had never seen anything like that. Just watching folks come in, these young men. I was working mostly with adolescent boys in those groups, and watching just the level of like withdrawal, shutdown, maladaptive coping skills. Like watching these guys over the course of 2 to 3 months, just like the light of life was back in them, and they were communicating, they were applying these new skills, they were becoming very thoughtful. I was not that emotionally intelligent when I was that age. I managed to stay out of trouble, but I got to see just amazing stuff happen. And you're around that enough, and you start to, and you're around a culture of staff that are also pushing you to be introspective, asking you, hey, how are your patterns showing up with how you're working here with the kids? How are they showing up in your staff team? How much are you allowing fear and coping skills and defense mechanisms to run the show? And those were pretty uncomfortable questions for me. I'd gotten by, like I said, been staying out of trouble, kept the grades up when I was younger, and that was enough to like not get a negative attention spotlight on me. I thought I was good. So that was a big aha moment, and I eventually became just so enamored with this idea of like how do we create a culture like that where great staff and really stellar all-star clients even can come through and then graduate, and the culture remains. That was a really interesting question to me.
Yeah.
So I then went and studied organizational psychology, to think about that lens of culture, and that eventually got me interested in and exposed to this idea of the unconscious dynamics of groups, and kind of the unsigned contracts that we sign and the roles we take without really consciously agreeing, and all the ways that groups can conspire and pull us away from our goals. It's like this beautiful mess that I became very interested in. Uh, and so in my leadership roles with organizations, I've tried to apply that lens. And now as a consultant working with families, trying to apply that lens to the family system, but also in how I vet organizations, how I look at functionality in organizations, and kind of informing that approach and how we ask questions.
I mean, you hit on a lot of stuff there, and it's obvious. I'm sitting here listening to you, and the wilderness component of your background and your skill set just hits me
Right.
literally right in the chest, right in my heart, because that's where I started my career.
Hmm.
Got some years on you. I started in like the mid 90s and worked in a wilderness setting till 2008. Um, and one of the things I wrote down was your schedule, right? Eight days on, 6 days off. And my schedule is 5 days on, 48 hours off.
Right.
And I think back to that time and how you're relating that to some of your organizational leadership stuff. I tell people all the time, I feel like I'm a good leader. I'm a really good dad, I believe, and I think I think I'm a really good husband, and I owe that a lot of that to my
Hmm.
experience leading a group of kids in a wilderness setting, and I say that with all sincerity in the world. Like the skill sets that I have today, I don't know if I have them without that experience leading kids in that setting, and
Hmm.
so let me say that. And the other thing that you mentioned that I wrote down and underlined was risk management. And
Hmm.
I tell people all the time, when I started, kids came into the wilderness program that I worked at, which were juvenile justice involved kids.
Hmm.
Our standard issue for them was like appropriate clothing for the outdoor setting, right? And some backpacks and some other stuff, but we handed them a knife. Like we gave them a knife.
Hmm.
And to this day, people are like, that must have been insanity. What were you guys thinking? And I was like, we're teaching them responsibility. There was some structure and rules around that. And the culture allowed that new kid to come into the group to see the kid
And
was
some
ready to
trust. There's
graduate,
inherent some
right?
trust there, right?
It was a
Yeah.
trust thing. And the 16-year-old who was getting ready to graduate the program, who had the similar history to the kid who was coming in, see that kid ask for permission to open the knife, put on a safety glove, and start
Hmm.
carving respectfully and within a boundary. Well, that new kid learned pretty quickly. There 9 other young men are doing it this way. I got to do it this way. So, I mean, I don't know where this is going, but it kind of matches
Yeah.
with what you've shared, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much to unpack there. I'm reminded of Jonathan Haidt's work. He does a lot of work.
Love them.
Look, he's got that Coddling of the American Mind book and a few other ones. I haven't actually kept up with his later work, but this idea that um, more autonomy, more responsibility, more free, unstructured play, and more exposure to danger, for lack of a better word, is actually a core part of developing, and that we've, as a society, really moved far away from that. And I think that's reflected in the wilderness stuff. I in the wilderness therapy programming, and there's a balance because, of course,
Right.
right, like we have to manage risk, we have to have a relationship with that, but yeah, I do think a lot of the time, even clients coming in with mental health concerns are capable of way more than we think.
Hmm.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
yeah, like also that power of culture. This may sound a little weird, but I'll explain. There's studies in primatology, and there's a primatologist named Franz de Waals, who works at Emory, or at least he used to be a professor at Emory, and he's got a book called Our Inner Ape. And it's fascinating to watch his reflections on like chimp and bonobo group cultures because yes, they're not humans, but we're so out of the way. Like we're not as much in our own story when we're watching those things happen. And I believe that one of the studies, this I don't think was Franz de Waal or whatever his name is, but looking at introducing like chimps that came from a violent group norm
Hmm.
introduced into like it may have even been with bonobos, but where a really peaceful group, and that violent behavior gets checked and not tolerated, and you can slowly, if you're methodical about it, you can slowly rotate folks chimps that have
Yep.
had violent histories and have had that behavior. You can rotate them one by one into that other group and eventually like replace the whole group with what were violent chimps that now have adopted a peaceful group culture, which is,
Right.
it's crazy, right? It's really
Right.
cool.
Yeah, it's so my so I'm a therapist, but I think because I'm that I can crap on us the most from like a position of authority because again I've got a lot of love for us, but I also have some real frustration with how we have I don't know what the word is, but like over certified this space, over intellectualized this space and made it so we've put so many kind of so much gatekeeping, I think largely ineffective, but we've kind of blocked out some really amazing programming models because we consider them non-clinical. Anybody who says the word non-clinical, as a clinician, I always want to like punch in the face. I'm like, I don't know what you mean. Is it effective for kids or is it not? Is it moving the needle or is it not? So some of that, because and to camp out, well, ironically, I guess camp out, no pun intended, in the residential space, because again, you were probably the last of that order almost, because really around probably what 2015, the scrutiny started to build, and that industry, sadly, or my read on it, you probably know more than I do, but actually I was really, really interested in that. That was going to be my first job out of school before I even thought about being a therapist. I wanted to go live in the woods and work with kids because that's all I like to do. And some of my most profound personal experiences were coming from hiking the Appalachian Trail and stuff like that. But that's really kind of a dying industry, other than for maybe the uber wealthy now, it feels like, because the folks who used to be able to access that through DJJ or Medicaid or lower socioeconomic, we've kind of deemed that not appropriate for kids because there were some bad apples and some bad experiences. But I feel like that's a loss. I feel like that's a net negative and this is not a pro, it's not a, I don't know, but that feels like a net loss for our service industry.
Yeah, I was impressed with myself and how I said I said it on this podcast I recently did with Will White, where just this idea that if you are not exposed to extremely challenging situations, you will not internalize that you're capable of rising to those challenges. And there's something around the resilience there that's lost. We could look at the metrics. You could scrape data for programs and look at how many days, for example, wilderness therapy programs have groups that are actually off trail versus being like at a campsite 50 feet from the road. That's a different psychological container for the group. You see different behaviors emerge on clients when they're backcountry. The old wisdom, the old guiding wisdom was that you actually saw some of the hardest kids doing the best work when they can't see a road, when they're way back out there and you really are like feeling remote and you're in this little kind of village container. A lot of that does kind of go out the window. I think we've kind of swung past the sweet spot, right? Like, so
yes.
Mike, everyone likes to talk about the wild 90s generation, and it's usually these days, it's usually in a fairly derogative tone or around there not being enough risk management. But the flip side of that is that the folks that stuck around in the industry are the ones that are front running and spearheading better practices. So there's a little bit of like, hey, let's also acknowledge that the people that came up got to see how that works and have helped the evolution of the industry. I think there's some credit that's due there. It's not really a popular thing to throw out at the moment, but where was I going? So I do think that probably everyone says this, but like when I was there, it felt like that golden age where it was you could do a lot. You had a lot of freedom, a lot of leeway to craft interventions and work through these dynamics. And I credit that with, I don't think I'm one of a very few company that has spent 10,000 hours working with the small groups in a therapeutic setting and then gone and studied master's level like group work, and that you just don't get that same experience when there's when it's less wildernessy effectively.
What do you think?
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that to me, because I was in leadership roles kind of post grad school, which that was the 2017, 2019, 2020 years before COVID. But in that range, I was starting to see, I think the first real wave was staff culture changing. So as like a field director, for example, I was noticing that my staff were, it was blowing my mind some of the questions and requests I was getting from staff that I would never have dreamed of or imagined any of my fellow staff doing before. This is going to sound like one of those, when I was a kid, we
do that a lot on this podcast. That's okay.
Right. Like we were so much more badass than this generation, whatever. But really, I remember getting a request from wilderness guides in one of the programs I was a director for, that that the group get pulled because it was going to be rainy and in the 40s.
Right.
And I was like, I cannot believe I'm hearing that. It's an admission of incompetence, effectively, that they don't, and it's also feedback for the system that they haven't been
Yeah.
trained to like navigate and manage, because those are difficult situations. But that's just like a typical
Yeah.
Tuesday.
Well, you name checked Jonathan Haidt, and we've name checked him a couple of times. His newest book, The Anxious Generation's on my nightstand, and I think he's brilliant. And I think his quote that he either said or parroted is, we need to be preparing kids for the road, but we've changed that to start to prepare the road for the kids.
Mm.
And that is not how life works. And I guess what you're describing, I never really thought about it like that, but it's a fair point, is the softening, and not this kind of like machismo way, but just the lack of resilience, whatever's been happening over the last couple of decades that's leading to less resilient people statistically. Now, those people are then leading, they're in these programs, they're supposed to be the ones that are leading the way. Now, they're not as resilient, they're higher anxiety.
Mhm.
No wonder there's probably a spike in incidents and issues and challenges, because it's the blind leading the blind, whereas there used to be at least a differentiation between the adults and child. And now I think maybe that gap is closing. I'm just so curious where we started to kind of lose this battle. And then I also wonder, one of the things that I push a lot is, wonder why some of these programs are so bad at telling their story.
Yeah.
Why there's got to be so, like, when I hear Mike could tell 1,000 stories that probably like a private philanthropy person would want to give him $5 million tomorrow to start a wilderness program, because he tells them so sincerely, and they're real stories of real change. But on the macro, the negative seems to certainly drown out the positive when it comes to this corner of the space. And I don't understand that. I don't see these programs telling their story well.
There's a model, and I'll say that I agree with you. I also think that just in the therapeutic industry in general, there's the opposite problem is also a thing where you get a lot of mediocre to poor programs that have hired folks to tell their story very,
Yeah.
very expertly. And so, this is the other side of the spectrum, but like a cookie cutter, low paying for their therapist type of super temporary program that's milking insurance. A lot of times these guys will have great web developers.
All shine, no substance.
Right. Yeah. So there's the other world too.
25 and 12. Simple, seemingly ordinary numbers, but these numbers hold a special meaning at New Hope and prompted us to take action. 25, the percentage of young men diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, a number that is growing. 12, the average number of months families must wait for specialized residential treatment. But those days are over. Welcome to New Hope's Learning Enriched Autism Program, or as we like to call it, LEAP. New Hope may not change the 25, but we're impacting the 12. We're expanding this program from 6 to 20 beds, investing in the highest quality of treatment models and support systems. LEAP's team of specialists combines the best autism research with trauma-informed care and relational connections to create an environment where our youth thrive. At LEAP, youth learn the skills to reintegrate into their communities and chase their dreams. Families receive the support and resources to ensure this is the last residential treatment they'll ever need. With our enhanced program, the number that holds the most meaning to us now is 40. That's the number of successful LEAP graduates we anticipate annually. That's 40 lives changed. That's 40 families finding new hope through LEAP. That's our name. That's our promise.
One of the things, a great friend of mine and a former colleague who I worked with in that wilderness setting, he had been there longer than I had, and he had moved along to a different job and different role. And I asked him, like, what's going on? Why are you leaving? I thought you were a lifer. You'd be in this setting and work in this space forever. And he said, Mike, I'm beginning to think we're hiring and asking staff to do things they are no longer willing or capable of doing.
Mm, mm.
And that hit me. Like, there was a time when we were hiring staff, and I had somebody come to an interview to work for us, and their mom or dad came along. I was like, wow, like this was a 23 or 24-year-old college
Hmm.
grad, and mom tagged along to kind of, you know, put her 2 cents in and kind of make sure it was. And I thought, boy, this individual's not gonna this is not gonna work out, right? So that goes back to your former point that the culture, are we hiring people prepared to do this work is is
Yeah.
interesting, and I think a good conversation.
Yeah, like a really rudimentary metaphor is that like we're not really willing to feed the vegetables to the toddler anymore. It's like we're putting so much sugar on there, and eventually it's like, hey, somebody's like, hey, I actually figured out that we just get the broccoli off the spoon, they'll just eat it immediately, and
Right.
then what do you have, There are the two things. Yes, I love that. But the two things I was going to say is one, Matt, your point, um, again referencing Jonathan Haidt or Haidt, I always forget how to say his name, but there's this Zen, or it may have been Alan Watts who had this metaphor of you can either try to cover the world in rubber or you can put on a pair of shoes, right? And so it's like, what are we doing here?
Right.
And then the other one I wanted to touch on too is you're asking, and Mike, that may have been you asking about like where did this all start? Like how do we pinpoint kind of the causality of this shift that may or may not be helpful? There's this at my grad school, they really hammered it into us because one of the professors was worked there, but it's called the Burke-Litwin model, and it's kind of complex like way of conceptualizing organizations. But one of the key tenets of it is just looking at the influence of the environment and how that's a stressor or potentially hampers or um, enables organizations. You can look at case studies for how this works in all kinds of situations, right? Like when the governmental free money was coming in, like everybody was a genius investor, all this stuff. And it's like, well, maybe that was the outside environment more than me being great at picking like dog cryptocurrencies or something. But the outside environment in this situation, I think we are just seeing a very wide cultural shift where it like the idea of marginalization or like the oppressor, I would say even like a wider application of Cartman's drama triangle, where there's a lot of like this unconscious drive to like find the villain and that kind of mentality. Um, and yeah, I've seen like staff internalize that and come in prepackaged with that idea where I mean, forget the idea of ask not what you can do for your country, ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you or whatever. Forget that idea. It's more just like people coming in with this mindset of like I'm just waiting for this company to slip up so I can like think of them as oppressing me somehow. And that's not congruent with this idea of crafting a container that encourages hardship and moving through it gracefully. And it's a wider cultural phenomenon, and I think it's hit the industry hard. You're talking about a very vulnerable subsystem within therapeutic treatment that really asks that there be a specific internalized philosophy among staff, among therapists, among management that they really stick to and hold to. And it's very hard when you have a rising culture of teen influencers on the internet where their voice is amplified thousands of times what it would have been before. And so you have a few folks. I mean, if you're working with a population of clinical personality disorders, and that's something that you help people with, and you help 100 kids, you're going to have quite a few folks that really want to light the building on fire and like hurt the company. And now if they have 40,000 followers on Instagram or whatever, it's like they have a lot of leverage.
Yeah, it's a wild time. I mean, it is I think the level of evolution that we are going through, society, from a societal standpoint, culture, how that impacts mental health, like, is just crazy. Like I don't think anybody can overstate it. And I've heard people try to overstate it, and I still think they're understating just how wild this is. And obviously, New Hope, some of what we do is, or what we've done for the last 3 or 4 decades now, is residential treatment for high risk adolescents. We're not going into the wilderness, but it's still this idea that that there are indeed youth out there whose struggles exceed the grasp of their community setting to keep them safe. And again, I'll tell you, and maybe it's the immediacy of the scheduling of this podcast. We've had a shitty week at New Hope. Like I've had a bad week. It's been a tough week at New Hope, particularly amongst our older adolescent male group. And you talk about group dynamics, maybe pivot to this a little bit, because it's been a group dynamic. It's not been a group dynamic. It's not been a group culture. It's been a culture of a bunch of individual kids who are so hurt that they want to hurt everything at large, right? It's been a destructive, unfortunate week. We'll get through it. It'll pass. I know that some of those kids today that, tried to rip down the ceiling earlier this week are going to be the kids that are graduating in September. But to try to explain to the outside world that process and that flow is really hard. But also just trying to imagine those kids being successfully and safely treated anywhere else. My mind, I can't reconcile with it. So it's like, man, because there are some days where I'm like, yeah, we're not good enough. But then I'm thinking, well, who the hell else can even try to do this? Like, I don't, take any of that, Brant. I'm curious where you take any of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't remember if this was before we pressed the record button or not, but yeah, I work with complex families, complex presentations, clinical presentations. We're often getting phone calls from desperate parents who don't understand even where to start in navigating that landscape. I'm appreciative. There are you guys and A New Hope, and then a few other organizations like you are kind of where I turn and try to get a client your way that really was a good fit. They're just, to your point, there aren't a lot of folks that can handle the complexity in a really graceful, relational way. You guys are in a small basket there. And so, yeah, it's super needed. Obviously, a little bit of a different shift. We're not talking about wilderness therapy per se in that same sense, but yeah. I don't know, but I'm starting to just ramble.
My point is that it's, even when it's great, it's still messy. And the point around the whole world around us getting more litigious, more critical, coming in guns blazing, coming in defensive, coming in looking to punish the helpers who are, hey, we didn't create this. We're just trying to mitigate some of it is creating a really tricky environment. And this is not a boohoo New Hope sentiment. It's a genuine macro fear for that. If we, I'm just seeing these two data points, like challenges are on the rise. Providers who are willing to meet the moment are probably on a decline because their risk managers are saying, no, we're not serving that population. No, we'll serve 8-year-olds, but not 17-year-olds. And we'll serve non-aggressive kids, but not aggressive kids. And we'll do groups of 2 and 3, and we'll have a 40-month waiting list, but we're not going to do groups of 12 anymore. That I don't know where that blows up, but that's got to be on a trajectory to blow up.
Yeah. I have some concerns. I am also a believer. This has limits, so I don't want to say this as like a universal law per se, but I am a believer in what I would call equilibrium forces in groups and even like larger culture where certainly not always, but we can see kind of these unpredictable counterweights come in to maybe help us move back into a better direction. And potentially things like this podcast and what the work that you guys are doing is a part of that process. I've always been just really impressed with that resilience or ways that like groups and larger groups even find their way back to some sort of equilibrium. I agree. We're like swinging in a pretty concerning direction.
But you've got an optimism that there always seems to be a centralized, like it kind of comes back to center somehow, some way, even if you can't.
Yeah, it's not always necessarily the most the process isn't always what I would call value-based or principles first, integrity-based, but you do see there's a a tendency among groups to want to swing back to some sort of equilibrium. And you're
Right.
talking about a situation where more and more people's needs are just simply not being met. So we're talking that's not equilibrium. That's disequilibrium. And it might be some landmark um, legislation type of things that come through. We're
Mm.
obviously seeing a lot of changes there around like the healthcare conversations, and of course, can't really have this conversation is way different in a context where like Affordable Healthcare Act didn't include like mental health into the
Right.
Mm.
conversation, right? So this is like the milieu, the larger milieu that we're having this conversation in. I guess yes, I'm optimistic, but not certain that we're going to just see a swing back in a direction. But I do think people are getting more comfortable having these conversations, which was different than 4 years ago.
What
Mm.
I just to shift it a little bit, Brant. One of the things that I noted in our conversation when we met, one of the things that we've really tried to emphasize at New Hope is the family involvement when a child does need to go to a residential setting. I think you've done some research or work around this. Can you speak to a little bit about that, the importance of that, what you've seen, what the data shows, or what the trends are? Because I know that one of the things
Mm.
over the years we've gotten better at that. I would
Mhm.
argue that when I started at New Hope in 2010, we were a little bit more
Mm.
resistant to that. Boy, these are, we just need to get this kid away from that family for a while,
Yeah.
not tie him in at all, and then all of a sudden think they're going to be great going home in 6 months or whatever. Can you speak to it a little bit?
Yeah. The trend I've seen and have heard from others, I don't have hard data, but is that families move more slowly. Now, a lot of the clients that I have worked with it feels just very slow. You're talking about families that really are in crisis, like kind of a perpetual state of crisis where maybe they have a child that's suicidal, for example, and or had an attempt fairly recently, and that's not the type of situation you want to be twiddling your thumbs in.
Mm.
I think all of the stuff that we've, analysis paralysis, but really also just looking at like within the family system, which people are where on the stages of change even, right?
Uh-huh.
Because you might have like mom feeling ready for a change. You might even have like the kid kind of um complying around it, even if they don't fully agree, but maybe in that like pre-contemplative, like starting to flirt with contemplative, and maybe dad is just like therapy is bullshit.
Mm.
Um, and from that systems perspective that I take, like I'm usually trying to ask, at least on a good day when I'm sharp, I'll be trying to ask like, okay, what is dad holding for the system? What is his like role here? Um, Rather than just taking it at face value of like, gotta work with dad, then gotta work with mom, then gotta work with the kid. Because if you don't have that holistic perspective, you might feel like you're getting a shift with dad and somebody else just like takes up that role because the system is used to operating with a certain paradigm. Um, so yeah, I try to like just take that lens. There's another question. What was part two of that?
Like in terms of family involvement
Oh, right.
and treat, like
Yeah, yeah,
what are you
yeah.
seeing? Have you seen over the years more engagement with the family, more emphasis on that, successful rates and things like that?
Yeah, that's such a slam dunk question. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it's of course, yes, we've seen, I mean, massive adoption of the family model. This is actually another area though where I would encourage us to look at, has the pendulum swung past the center point where I think we've
Mm.
evolved past this idea of like, okay, well, little Billy is the problem in an otherwise healthy family.
Right.
Get him to treatment, fix him, ship him back or to a boarding, a longer term treatment option, depending on
Right.
what's appropriate. And we've moved towards where, past this middle point, which in my mind is let's have both lenses operational, where we look at where is Billy and where his coping skills, where is his anxiety showing up in relationships, what kind of diagnoses is he dealing with, all of these individualized questions, and then also how does that fit in with the family system? How can we coach parents around communication to,
Right.
um, and where I've seen is clinicians and folks kind of like in this analysis paralysis space where they don't if you have too much of a systems view and there's really no like space for personal accountability, it becomes just like this vague blobby mush of like, well, we're working with the family system and
Right.
it's about the container. And you really, and it's like in an effort to not blame, I've
Right.
seen clinicians avoid any sort of implementation of holding people accountable or looking at that and just defaulting to an ineffective lens of only looking at the family system.
That's an
Right.
interesting point. I've heard Matt kind of speak to that. I'm going to let you jump in there, Matt.
Well, and yeah, I think 1,000%, and I think it's a little bit of a co-opting of like the trauma-informed language
Oh
as
yeah.
well. I have seen where it's like trauma-informed means zero,
Yep.
consequences, and again, it's just not how I don't think it's what that word means. And I always view it's like, listen, me being trauma-informed means that I know that this kid, sadly, is wired towards chaos, and that chaos is actually his comfort zone, and that he's going to keep repeating those trauma cycles until we get him to stop. And I'm going to be the guy who's tough enough and sturdy enough to, take the hits, take the cussing, take the pushback,
Yep.
so that he can actually get used to something that's not that. And again, it's going to be messy, but that's trauma informed because it's actually it's the lens in which I'm approaching it. But it might sometimes look like Mike O'Connor, 1997, tough, just conversation too. There might not be any discernible difference between some of what I'm doing clinically and what Mike was doing in the woods in the 90s. Because again, I think some of this stuff wasn't created in a book. To your point, I think some of this stuff is primal and kind of universal. And again, I think in our attempts to mitigate against the worst actors in our space, we've shifted away. That's an interesting thing. I never really thought about the family piece of that, but I can see that. I know that we find a lot of therapists have actually no skills to work with a family system and still remain, although they do understand its importance, they're fundamentally scared to work with the family, scared of parents, intimidated by parents. And parents are doing that, I think, subconsciously sometimes because, hey, I don't want you to deal with my stuff. So I'm going to act tough. So you back off and still just work with my kids. So I'm still in at least my observation, maybe of our own corner of the sandbox, is that the family work has been grabbed onto philosophically. Functionally, we still have just a long, long ways to go.
Right. Yeah. I think there are some folks that do a beautiful job of kind of holding like nuance and therapy and programming, but it's so much easier to fall into one of two traps and to get, in all these little double binds we deal with. Like what I'm hearing you say, and I agree with, is that oftentimes trauma-informed care is code for just keeping a client comfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's the nuance there, of course, is that having a healthy base and even thinking about through like nervous system activation, right? Like there isn't going to be great learning if there isn't at least a break from distress.
Yep.
And also, if you're in a therapeutic environment, that's not the place to just create a comfortable environment. Like we got to get into the mess,
Right.
And so there should be this equilibrium. There should be discomfort. We should see like those regressive defensive mechanisms coming out and really displaying. This is one of those things that you have to kind of pre-coach parents on, is that you might see it come out more here because we're gonna like create a safe container that's emotionally safe, but it is not going to be enabling or
placating.
Placating, right? So we're gonna hold some hard lines here, and then it's our responsibility to have that be a safe container to work with. It's our responsibility to have enough staff and staff that are well trained to work with that. And the shortcut that unconsciously or consciously that organizations can fall into is you got to check a lot of boxes for that to be the case. Like either you got a staff that's been there for 3 months, they don't have the skills. I don't care who you are. You're not going to have the skills to like really have a lot of sophistication in managing your own countertransference in the relationship and having great communication skills in the heat of battle, so to speak. Like that's a hard thing to do. If we're talking about mastery of a complex skill set,
right?
And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely hear that all the time. I hear it's funny because at this point, nobody is actually impressed when an organization claims that they're trauma informed. It's just such,
right.
That was, again, 8 years ago. It was like, oh, well, what does that mean? And
that's like food being organic. It's like my Cheetos were organic yesterday. It's like, okay, my stuff from QT was organic. It's all good.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, I mean, you had the, Body Keeps the Score becoming really popular in the 2010s, and some of these pieces that really like shine a spotlight and helped evolve in some good ways, how we think about trauma. But then there's just like so much nuance that you have to implement in order to provide effective programming. And it is easier in the short term to placate, to try to keep the peace, and you end up doing a disservice for somebody that's paying a lot of money to try to just build a better future for their family. We call it, this is old therapist Lou Vaughn back in the day would call it the hard easy, or the easy hard. You can do the easy thing now and it's hard later, or do the hard thing now and it's easy later.
100%.
Brant, as you've transitioned into more of a consulting role, when you look back to your time for Therapeutic Wilderness, any skill sets or lessons that come to mind that you've applied to your personal and professional growth and journey during your time today?
Yeah, the biggest one, man, to me would just be that power of saying the truth bluntly and without decoration. We call it assertive communication is what we're talking about. There's a way I learned, and it blew my mind, that you can get away with saying a lot more truth than you thought if you aren't emotionally charged about it. And I've watched groups, kind of like staff teams or therapists even kind of cower in the corner about and tiptoe around something where this basic truth or reality testing that needs to be done with the client. And then, when that's happening, you're dealing with all this fear and anxiety on the part of the staff or internally with us. I'll use I statements, right? Like I've been in this situation, of course, where I'm terrified to tell somebody something, but I think it's important for them to hear, or I need to advocate for something for me. And like, if you can work through that fear and not have that charge, you can get away with saying a lot of true things, which is, freeing. And it also reinforces itself and becomes like a skill set that builds on itself. You become more and more confident that you can do that.
At New Hope, we believe that culture is everything. Residential services is what we do, but culture defines who we are. Sadly, poor culture issues are at the heart of unfortunate incidents involving staff and kids in residential programs all across the country. These incidents have led some to question whether residential services should even have a role in our mental health system of care. This is why, at New Hope, we are called to be different. We are called to stand out from the crowd. Our kids' experiences will be a direct reflection of our culture. So, let's name it and let's build it.
We are committed to a culture of positive relationships. Relationships that are built on trust and care for our kids, each other, and the community.
We're committed to a culture of teamwork. We always ask, how can I help? And we never say, that's not my job.
We are a culture of fun and laughter. We take our work seriously, but not ourselves too seriously.
We are committed to a culture of shared excellence. Leaders are always coaching, so team members are always growing.
That's the New Hope culture. Our goal is to be the best provider in the country. And our culture demands that everyone is passionately rowing in the same direction, at the same speed. We call these commitments because the culture is continuously created and maintained by our actions every day. It's not static. It's a living, breathing thing. It's built in every conversation, every email, every conflict, every interaction. You, watching this video, are either actively building this culture or actively working against it.
committed.
I'm committed.
I'm committed to building the culture.
Attention New Hope staff and all communities, we have a successful discharge in the lobby. Please put your hands together and show your love for Joshua.
I'm committed to building a culture at New Hope that everyone wants to be a part of. My question is, are you in?
Brant, do you mind telling? I mean, I know a book has been released recently. I know you're doing some podcast circuits. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how your story informed?
Yeah.
Why this book? Why now?
I'm so bad at plugging that. It's like, what are we in, like 50 minutes into the conversation? Yeah. Yeah,
we're equally bad at letting guests plug things, so it's fine. It's perfect.
Sometimes we don't even tell people the name of the podcast. We're just like, good pod. Yeah. Even though I've got right next to me.
Yeah, it's the book came out in November of 24. It's called Gods, Heroes, and Groups: Relational Dynamics Through Mythic Archetypes. And so the idea there, in a nutshell, there were these books there was Iron John, there was King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, books that come from the post-Jungian tradition of looking at archetypes and developmental psychology. Basically applying myth and the metaphors in myth, the powerful metaphors in these stories that we keep telling over and over and over again. How do those apply at a deeper level? Like, what is it that's important about those stories, and how does that relate to modern psychological frameworks? Well, we took that and applied that thinking to groups, which I don't really think has been done very much. Mm-hmm. There's a Norwegian author that has a book in Norwegian that I haven't been able to read, but there's a surprising lack of literature. It's like those two fields really don't talk. There's these great models for understanding groups and looking at the unconscious dynamics in groups and the things that are unsaid. That's in the realm of organizational psychology. And then there's this whole beautiful, really poetic literature that it's called mythopoeticism, right? Like looking at fables and myth and how those interact with modern psychological thinking and how that can inform us in our developmental psychological approach. Those fields don't really talk. So this is looking at myth and modern group frameworks and looking at the synthesis and how those interrelate. And there's some pretty cool connections that can be made. We really view it as a starting point, and the hope would be that it strikes a chord. And, I'd be excited if somebody else came and wrote or recorded something that like blew it wide open and really expanded on some of those ideas. But I do think it's an important synthesis, and I think it's an important time for that too. I think we really need to reduce polarization. I think we need to increase our, what I would call group IQ, like group intelligence, which is bigger than Goleman's like social intelligence even, but just like how the awareness and the insight that we have about how our groups work. That's important stuff.
What would you say was the biggest connect when you say those two worlds or those two things coming together and seeing some common ground or connectedness? When you look back at the work you did in this book you wrote, was there a connection that you saw and you're like, wow, these two things marry, and that's pretty cool?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of when exactly that was. I started when the pandemic hit. I was running a nonprofit that did rites of passage work for adolescent boys.
Yeah.
I was taking a little bit of break from wilderness therapy, and like I took the job, and 2 weeks later, everything was canceled because of the pandemic. So I was sitting there drawing a paycheck, trying to spend a few hours of the day trying to figure out how to be productive and what that even looked like. And then I had a lot of time and bandwidth, and I was like, well, to keep myself sane, I'm going to try to pursue more of my understanding of groups. This has been an area that I've been passionate about. And I couldn't find resources that really grabbed me. There are some great books out there, and there are some good resources that have come out since 2020. But yeah, I in lieu of being able to read a ton on it, I started writing, because at that point I'd accumulated like 10,000 hours of experience working with groups. If you do the math on 4 years of wilderness therapy and the waking hours that you're just in these intense group dynamics, it's like 10,000 hours. That's a high number, and then having had the training and the formal experiences doing group relations work in these experiential conferences over the years, do those consistently. But yeah, I started writing and also having some leadership experience at that point. And that's just kind of what came out. I'd been impressed. There'd been a few therapists and consultants and facilitators that I'd seen who were able to beautifully bring in myth. And Robert Bly, obviously, he wrote Iron John. That book was really influential. But as I was writing, it became just a way I could express it and get some of these ideas a little bit more fine-tuned, and ended up becoming a big theme. And I kind of felt like I ended up stumbling on something that felt important, and like, if I can be arrogant enough to say a novel niche, I don't really think there's much in the way of that type of work, but I really think it could be valuable.
And who is there? Is it a broad audience, Brant? Is it a clinical audience? Is it people out in the trenches? Is it academia? Or you hope it's a little bit of all of the above?
Probably all of the above. I do think you need to be pretty curious and kind of a little dorky or nerdy to really love it, but if you're curious about groups, or if you've been in any team environment where you've been the brunt of scapegoating dynamics, or you've seen it happen and you're curious about it and you just want to dive into kind of what's going on beneath the surface there, I think this is a good starting point. It's we definitely have put a lot of effort into citing resources and trying to make it robust, but it's also not like an academic work. It should be readable. It's 125 pages or something like that. Just right, that's my kind of size for a book these days. And you can kind of take a chapter at a time and chew on it. But yeah, to me, it's a great introduction for anyone that either runs groups, is curious about groups, leads teams, or just wants to understand a little bit more what's going on under the hood.
Like I said, I think we're going to pick up a few for our adolescent boys community leaders that I referenced earlier, because again, it's easy to, and again, seasons come and seasons go, but I also do believe, to your point around becoming so systemic, you can't become so that can translate to passive, which can translate to, well, we just have a group of tough kids right now, so we're going through a tough season. And then you absolve the leadership responsibility of actually changing this. Whereas, like you said, the primate studies show, no, if this is a healthy group, we can actually absorb a lot of challenges, and the system changes the individual as opposed to the individuals changing the system, which is honestly what has probably happened. So there's something that has been lost that we can recapture on a micro with that book. But it also sounds like it's got some really interesting kind of macro stuff, because certainly as a culture right now, we're bizarrely getting more grouped, but we're also bizarrely getting more siloed. It's a bizarre time again. So I've not read it yet, but when Mike sent it to me, it looked, in my nerd lane, it looked right in my sweet spot. So
yeah, you guys would probably pretty much be the ideal kind of audience.
We're the audience.
Just, dork out about it, and
Hey, one of the things real quick, and then the group dynamic thing, and Matt, you were just talking. The groups that I worked with were typically 10 or 11 kids, maybe sometimes on 12 sometimes, but mostly 10 kids. And there were weekends where our kids would go home for the weekend to practice some of the things that they were learning at the program. Occasionally you would have 2 or 3 kids where there was a family situation where it wasn't okay to go home. So we would have we call it the homestay group. Well, the homestay group of 2 or 3 kids was much more difficult to manage, in my opinion, than 10, because the group dynamic changed instantly. And if you had one kid who got off their goals and maybe had an issue or got upset, you didn't have 7 other kids or 8 other kids or 9 other kids who may have been on their goals to kind of influence that kid's behavior. So you'd have one kid start acting out, then it was 2, then it was 3, and you were done. As a counselor, you were done. You had lost it.
Yep. You're speaking to this other piece that I love, and that is one of the deepest realizations I've ever had about leadership, and I'm sure I'm not the first, is that so much of it is just enabling peer culture, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's really amazing how much room for skill there is in managing groups.
Yeah.
What you're speaking to is, when you have that 10 kid milieu and you see, Jerry getting dysregulated, a lot of the time the move is, I think after maybe we've been in the role for a year or 6 months, we're like, hey, I see the problem. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to fix it. And then you see the real seasoned folks pull over the peer mentor.
Yes.
Say, hey man, like, what do you notice over here? Like, what do you think's going on for Jeremy? Right. Yeah, for Jerry. And then you're building culture, right? And Jerry or the kid is never going to attribute to you that you fixed a problem. It's like a peer collaboration.
You give the credit to the group.
Yeah, and you make them earn it too, right? It's like, it's not just a trick either. That is really what it takes. Like there's the Lao Tzu, right? Has the saying about I'm gonna butcher this, but the essence of it is that the real master in leadership or whatever is not felt or credited for it. It's you have a light presence and you allow for those that you're working with or working underneath you to really like flourish and discover their own potential. And you never, it doesn't even feel like you've ever touched anything, right?
I'm going to let Patrick go in a second, but to that point, I can't not say this. Before I got to New Hope, leaving the wilderness program, I spent a cup of coffee working for a behavioral healthcare hospital, right, in North Carolina. And the first meeting I attended, the CEO of that facility led a meeting that was supposed to start at 9. And somebody trickled in, a few people trickled in like at 9:05. And this is exactly how the meeting started. And this is the reason why I only had a cup of coffee there. He said, this meeting was supposed to start on time at 9 o'clock. You know why we're going to start it on time? Because I'm the CEO and that's why. And I was like, yeah, not my kind of leader. This is, meetings should start on time for other reasons besides this guy and his title. Anyway,
that's the Game of Thrones thing where he's like, if you need to say any king that needs to say they're the king is not the king. Right. Yeah.
I know we gave you this before we hit record, so you've had about 55 or so minutes to marinate on this final question. But Brant, I'm gonna ask you anyway. For you, what is the stuff that matters?
Yeah, I think having these conversations right now is really important and an okay starting point. We're not gonna get to make these big shifts happen overnight, but it starts with talking about it and allowing for disagreements. I think we all can kind of rally around a lot of the same concepts, but allowing for two-way communication and hearing other sides, but really just kind of getting in there and talking. That's a good starting point for me.
That's awesome. Well, Brant, it's been a pleasure to get to know you a little bit, and it makes me just happy to know that you're out there guiding families in need and through really tough and complicated waters. I think that's awesome. I hope your message continues to spread far and wide. And I agree, because again, I think once we all start talking, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who people are voting for. It doesn't really matter. Like, I think there is a 80% middle ground here of concepts that we agree on. And of concerns for the next generation and for our kids of where we're going. And again, to your point, there is maybe that natural thing that gets us back to center, but we're that thing, maybe, we're all part of that thing. So yeah. This was awesome, man. We will be sure to put some links out there where people can find you and follow you. But we appreciate your time today. It was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for all the work you guys do as well.
Thank you so much, Brant.
Thank you.